The rain in Atlanta didn't just fall, it screamed. It hammered against the roof of my blacked out Maybach like it was trying to break through the expensive armor I'd spent 30 years building around my life. Every drop felt like a judgment. Every flash of lightning felt like a spotlight on the mess I had become. My name is Sloane Sterling. To the world, I am the iron heiress of Sterling Global. I build skyscrapers that touch the clouds. I bridge gaps between billionaire investors. I am the woman who never, ever breaks under pressure. I've been trained since birth to be a predator in a silk suit, to value the bottom line over the beating heart. But tonight, as I sat in the back seat of this $200,000 cage, I was shattering into a million jagged pieces. My father's will had been read 3 hours ago. I got exactly what I thought I wanted: the company, the billions, and the weight of a legacy that felt like a noose. But I also got the one thing I couldn't handle. I got the truth about how he built it. I got a confession in a sealed envelope that proved my entire life was a lie. "Pull over," I choked out. The words felt like shards of glass in my throat. "Ma'am, we're on the freeway. The visibility is near zero." My driver, Otis, who had been with our family for 20 years, he knew my father's temper, and he knew my silence, but he didn't know this version of me. I said, "Pull over, Otis, now." The tires screeched against the wet asphalt as the heavy car swerved onto the shoulder of the bridge, overlooking the city. Before the engine even cut, I was out. I stumbled into the deluge, the cold water instantly soaking through my silk dress, a dress that cost more than most people's annual rent. I didn't care. I felt the ruin of the fabric against my skin, and for the first time in years, I felt something real. I walked toward the edge of the bridge. The city lights below blurred into a kaleidoscope of misery, shimmering in the puddles. I leaned against the cold iron railing, my fingers gripping the metal so hard my knuckles turned white. I looked down at the dark, churning water of the river. It looked so peaceful, so final. Then I felt it. A hand. It wasn't the soft, manicured hand of a board member. It was rough, calloused, and searingly hot. So hot it felt like it was burning right through the silk on my shoulder. "It's a long drop, lady," a voice rumbled. It was deep, like the sound of shifting earth or the low vibration of a factory floor. "And the water down there, it doesn't wash away what's bothering you. It just swallows it whole. You jump, and you're just giving the river another secret to keep." I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. He was standing there, barely 2 feet away. He didn't have an umbrella. He didn't have a raincoat. Just a worn, oil-stained denim jacket and a pair of eyes that looked like they'd seen the end of the world and decided to stay there anyway. They weren't obsidian. They were deeper, like looking into a well with no bottom. Kaelen Thorne, 34 years old. He looked like he was carved out of the very iron he worked with. There was a raw, masculine energy radiating off him that made the air around us feel electric, even in the freezing rain. He didn't look at my dress. He didn't look at the Maybach idling behind me. He looked at me. "Who are you?" I whispered. "Someone who knows what it's like to lose everything before the day even begins." He stepped back, the light from a passing car illuminating the silver-flecked stubble on his face. "Go home, Sloane. Dry off. The bridge will be here tomorrow, but once you go over, there's no coming back." He walked away toward a beat-up Ford F-150 parked further down the bridge. I watched him go, the rain blurring his silhouette until he was nothing but a shadow. I stood there for a long time, the cold seeping into my bones, wondering how a stranger knew my name and how he knew exactly what I was feeling. Wait, hold on. Before we see what happens when Sloane tries to find this mysterious man, I have to ask, have you ever been at a breaking point and had a complete stranger say exactly what you needed to hear? Where are you joining us from today? Drop your city and tell me, do you believe in fate, or was Kaelen's appearance just a coincidence? I'm reading every comment. The next morning, the Iron Heiress was back, or at least the mask was. I sat in my glass-walled office, the sun shining over Atlanta as if the storm had never happened, but the envelope was still on my desk, the confession that changed everything. My father hadn't just been a genius, he had been a thief, and the man on the bridge wasn't just a stranger. I pulled up the demolition records for the new Sterling Tech Plaza. There it was, a small plot of land in the 4th Ward, a metalworking shop owned by a man named Thorne. My company was scheduled to bulldoze it in 3 weeks to make room for a parking garage. I felt a sickening twist in my gut. I hadn't just met Kaelen Thorne. I was the woman who was about to destroy his life. I grabbed my keys. I didn't call Otis. I didn't take the Maybach. I took my private car and drove straight toward the part of the city I had spent my life avoiding. I had to know if those eyes were still as dark as they were on the bridge. I had to know if he knew who I really was. As I pulled up to the rusted gates of Thorne Ironworks, I saw him. He was wearing heavy leather coveralls, a welding mask pushed up onto his forehead. Sparks were flying around him like tiny stars. He looked up, and for a second, the world stopped. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He just stood there, holding a blowtorch like a weapon. "You're late," he said, his voice carrying over the hiss of the machinery. "Late for what?" I asked, stepping out of the car. "For the truth," he replied. "I figured it would take you at least 12 hours to track me down. You're at 14. You're losing your edge, Sterling." My heart hammered against my ribs. He knew. He had known the whole time. "What do you want, Kaelen?" He stepped toward the gate, the heat from the shop rolling off him like waves. "I want you to see what you're about to kill, and then I want to see if you have the guts to pull the trigger." The interior of Kaelen's truck smelled like old leather, peppermint, and iron. It was a far cry from the sterilized, scent-diffused air of my penthouse. I sat stiffly against the worn seat, my wet silk dress sticking to my skin like a second, cold layer of guilt. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice trembling. "To see what progress looks like from the ground up," Kaelen said. He didn't look at me. His eyes were fixed on the rain-slicked road as we descended from the glittering lights of Buckhang into the shadows of the 4th Ward. 10 minutes later, he pulled up to a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. Behind it sat a low brick building that looked like it had been holding its breath for 50 years. A sign hung crookedly over the door, "Thorne Ironworks." "This is it?" I asked, looking at the cracked windows and the weeds growing through the asphalt. "This is the threat to Sterling Global?" "It's not a threat to your money, Sloane," Kaelen said, cutting the engine. The silence that followed was heavy. "My grandfather built this place. He was your father's partner, not his employee, not his contractor, his partner." "I don't believe you," I whispered, though my heart was starting to hammer against my ribs. "You don't have to," Kaelen said, reaching into the back seat and grabbing a heavy canvas jacket. He tossed it into my lap. "Put that on. You're shivering and we have work to do." "Work? It's midnight." "The demolition crew you hired is coming Monday morning," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "If you want to know the truth before you tear this place down, you're going to help me move the last of the salvageable steel tonight." I looked at my manicured hands, then at the heavy, grease-stained jacket. Something in Kaelen's eyes, a mixture of exhaustion and fierce pride, stopped me from arguing. I put on the jacket. It was warm and smelled like him. Inside the shop, the air was cool and smelled of ozone. Massive iron beams were stacked against the walls like the ribs of a giant. "Grab that end," Kaelen commanded, pointing to a long iron rod. "I can't lift that." "Then use the lever," he said, not even looking back. "Stop acting like a Sterling and start acting like a human being. The world doesn't move just because you tell it to, Sloane. Down here, you have to push it." For the next 3 hours, I pushed, I pulled. I ruined a pair of $500 heels and broke 3 nails. My lungs burned, and sweat started to mix with the rainwater on my skin. Kaelen didn't go easy on me. He moved with a brutal efficiency, his muscles rippling under his shirt as he hoisted weight that should have been impossible for one man. We didn't talk. The only sounds were the clanging of metal and our synchronized breathing. Around 3 a.m., we stopped. Kaelen handed me a lukewarm bottle of water. I leaned against a workbench, my legs shaking. "Why do you stay?" I asked, looking around the crumbling shop. "With your talent, you could work anywhere. You could be a lead engineer at a firm like mine."
Kaelen leaned back, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. Because this is the only thing in this city that hasn't been bought and sold for a lie. When I weld two pieces of iron together, they stay. They don't betray each other. They don't look for a loophole. He stepped closer, his presence suddenly overwhelming. He reached out, his thumb brushing a smudge of grease from my cheek. His touch was rough, but his eyes were searching mine with an intensity that made me forget how to breathe. "You're not like him, are you?" he asked softly. "I'm a Sterling," I said, though it felt like a confession rather than a boast. "That's a name," he murmured, his face inches from mine. "I'm asking who you are when the name is gone." The air between us turned electric. I could see the flecks of gold in his dark irises. For a second, I wanted him to kiss me. I wanted him to erase the last 30 years of lies with one honest moment. But then his phone buzzed. He looked at the screen and his face turned to stone. "What is it?" I asked. "The permit," he said, his voice cold. "Your office just moved the demolition up. They're not waiting for Monday. They're coming tomorrow morning, at dawn." My stomach dropped. "I didn't authorize that. I told Otis we needed more time." "Otis doesn't work for you, Sloane," Kaelen said, walking toward the door. "The board wants this memory buried before you can find the shovel." He looked back at me, his eyes full of the old fire. "If you want to save your soul, you'd better find a way to stop those bulldozers, because I'm not moving, even if they bury me in the foundation." The sun hadn't even cleared the horizon when I pulled up to the gates of the Sterling estate. The mansion sat on the hill like a dying king, its white pillars graying with age and neglect. It was a place of ghosts, my father's cold silences, my mother's quiet departures, and 1,000 business deals that had traded souls for square footage. Kaelen was already there. He was leaned against the hood of his truck, a thermos in one hand and a heavy sledgehammer in the other. He watched me step out of my car. I had traded the Porsche for a rugged SUV and the silk for heavy denim and work boots that still felt too stiff. "You're 3 minutes early," he noted, his voice rasping in the cool morning air. "I didn't think you had it in you." "I'm full of surprises, Kaelen," I said, walking toward him. The gravel crunched under my boots, a sound I wasn't used to. I was used to marble. I was used to silence. He tossed a pair of heavy leather gloves at my chest. I caught them, the scent of old wood and iron filling my nose. "Don't talk, just work. We're starting with the library, your father's favorite room." Inside, the house felt tomb-like. The air was stagnant, heavy with the smell of old paper and expensive floor polish. Kaelen didn't waste time. He walked to the center of the mahogany-paneled room and traced a line along the wall with a piece of white chalk. "This paneling is solid African mahogany. It's worth 6 figures on the secondary market." "It's just wood, Sloane," Kaelen said, handing me a smaller hammer. Wood that was cut and polished to hide the fact that the man behind this desk was hollow. Today, we see what's behind the mask. He swung his sledgehammer. The sound was deafening. Crack. A piece of the expensive wood splintered, revealing the raw, dusty brick beneath. "It's your turn," he said, stepping back. I gripped the hammer. It was heavier than it looked. I swung, but I barely made a dent. The vibration traveled up my arms, jarring my shoulders. I felt ridiculous. I felt like a child playing at being a worker. "Continue," Kaelen commanded. He was standing right behind me now. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, a sharp contrast to the chill of the house. "I'm trying," I grunted, swinging again. Another pathetic thud. "No, you're thinking," he whispered. His voice was right at my ear, sending a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Stop thinking about the cost. Stop thinking about the heritage. Think about the first time he told you you weren't enough. Put that weight into the head of the hammer." He reached around me, his large, calloused hands covering mine on the handle. His chest pressed against my back, firm and steady. I froze. My breath hitched in my throat. I could smell the peppermint on his breath and the raw masculine scent of salt and sweat. "Together," he murmured. We swung. The hammer connected with the force of two people's frustrations. The mahogany shattered. Dust exploded into the air, dancing in the single shafts of sunlight piercing the windows. We did it again and again. By noon, the room was unrecognizable. The floor was covered in debris, and I was covered in a fine layer of gray dust. My hair had escaped its ponytail, clinging to my damp neck. My palms were screaming, even through the gloves. Kaelen stepped away to grab a water bottle. He took a long drink, his throat muscles working in a way that made it hard for me to look away. He tossed the bottle to me. "You're bleeding," he said, nodding toward my hand. I pulled off the glove. A blister had popped, a small smear of red staining my palm. "It's fine, I've had worse." "No, you haven't," he said, walking back to me. He didn't ask for permission. He took my hand in his touch surprisingly gentle for a man who had spent the morning destroying a house. He pulled out a small tin from his pocket and began rubbing a cool herbal salve into the wound. "Why are you doing this, Kaelen?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "You hate my family. You should be enjoying watching me struggle." He looked up, his obsidian eyes locking onto mine. The intensity was enough to make me want to run and stay at the same time. "I don't hate you, Sloane. I hate the cage you were put in, and I'm curious to see who comes out when the bars are gone." His thumb traced the line of my wrist, a slow, deliberate movement that made my heart race. The silence in the room changed. It wasn't the silence of a tomb anymore. It was the silence of a fuse burning down. "You think you're so different from me?" I said, trying to regain some of my footing. "But look at you. You're obsessed with the past. You're holding on to a shop that's falling down because you can't let go." "I'm holding on to the only thing that's honest," he countered, stepping closer. We were inches apart now. I could see the flecks of gold in his dark irises. "My grandfather built that shop with sweat and blood. Your father built this place with other people's tears. There's a difference." "And what am I building, Kaelen?" He reached out, his hand cupping my jaw. His skin was rough, but his touch was like velvet. "Right now, you're building a bridge. I just don't know if you're brave enough to cross it." He leaned in. I should have pulled away. I should have reminded him that I was his boss, that I was a Sterling, that we were on opposite sides of a war. But all I could feel was the magnetic pull of him. Our lips were a fraction of an inch apart when a loud, metallic thud echoed from the hallway. Kaelen pulled back instantly, his hand dropping to his side. His expression shifted from vulnerability to pure, cold steel in a heartbeat. "What was that?" I asked, my voice shaking. "That wasn't the house settling," Kaelen said, reaching for his hammer. "Someone else is in here." He moved toward the door, motioning for me to stay back, but I followed him. This was my house, my ghosts. We stepped into the grand foyer, and I froze, standing by the front door, looking at the destruction of the library with a look of absolute disgust, was Otis, but he wasn't alone. He was with two men in dark suits I'd never seen before. "Miss Sterling," Otis said, his voice devoid of his usual warmth. "The board of directors has called an emergency session. They've seen the photos of what you're doing here, and they've made a decision about your future." My stomach dropped. I looked at Kaelen. He wasn't looking at Otis. He was looking at the men in the dark suits, his eyes narrowed with a recognition that terrified me. "Sloane," Kaelen said, his voice a low warning. "Those aren't board members. Those are the men who tried to buy my shop last year, the ones who used my grandfather's name to threaten me." The world tilted. I looked back at Otis, the man who had been like a second father to me. He didn't look away. "It's time to come home, Sloane, before you lose more than just a house."
The silence in the grand foyer was heavier than the dust we'd kicked up in the library. I looked at Otis, the man who had held the umbrella over my head at my mother's funeral, the man who had taught me how to drive, and I didn't recognize him. His face was a mask of corporate coldness. "What did you just say to me, Otis?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. My hands were still covered in the grime of the demolition, and I felt a sudden, sharp surge of shame as I looked at my dirty fingernails. "The board has held an emergency session, Sloane," Otis repeated. He didn't call me Ms. Sterling. That was the first sign that the world had shifted on its axis. "Your recent, erratic behavior has been documented. Destroying a primary asset of the estate, working manual labor with a man whose property is currently in litigation with Sterling Global, it's a violation of the morality clause in your father's will." Kaelen stepped forward, his sledgehammer still gripped in one hand. He looked like a titan rising from the rubble. Litigation? Is that what you call it when you forge signatures and try to starve people out of their own homes? One of the men in suits, a thin man with eyes like a lizard, stepped toward Kaelen. Mr. Thorne, I suggest you lower your tone. You're trespassing on private property. I'm here on a contract, Kaelen spat, his voice vibrating through the hollow foyer, signed by the CEO of this company. The former CEO, the lizard man corrected with a sickeningly sweet smile. I felt the floor tilt. Former? I haven't been removed. There's a process. There are bylaws. Bylaws your father wrote to ensure his legacy was never tarnished by sentimentality. Otis took a step toward me. His voice softened, but it wasn't the warmth I remembered. It was the sound of a predator closing in. Sloane, look at yourself. You're covered in filth. You're standing in the ruins of your inheritance with a man who wants to see us fail. Come with us. We have a car waiting. We can handle the press. We can tell them you're grieving, that this was a temporary lapse in judgment. And what happens to the shop? What happens to the Fourth Ward? Otis sighed, a sound of genuine disappointment. The demolition of Thorne Ironworks begins on Monday morning. The contracts are locked, the investors are waiting. Not even you can stop it now. I looked at Kaelen. The look in his eyes was like a physical blow to my chest. It wasn't just anger. It was the look of a man who had finally been proven right about everything he feared. Monday? Kaelen's voice was low, dangerous. He turned to me, his jaw tight. You knew, didn't you? When you showed up at my shop, when you asked me to tear down this house, you knew the bulldozers were already gassed up for my place? No, I shouted, stepping toward him. I reached out, my dirty hand trembling, but he flinched away as if I were a leper. Kaelen, I swear to you, I didn't know the date. I was trying to find a way to stop it. That's why I wanted you here. I wanted to find the proof of... Proof of what? He snapped. That you're a Sterling? I think I've got all the proof I need. Mr. Thorne is right, the lizard man chimed in. This little project is over. Security is on the way to escort him off the premises. And, Sloane, if you don't get in that car with Otis, you won't just lose the company, you'll lose the Sterling name. Everything will be frozen. Your accounts, your properties, your access. You'll be a guest of the state. The threat was clear. They weren't just taking my job, they were taking my life. Go, Kaelen said. He didn't look at me anymore. He looked at the shattered mahogany doors of the library. Go back to your glass tower, Sloane. Go back to the people who speak your language. I should have known better than to think a butterfly could survive in a cage of iron. Kaelen, please, just let me explain, I begged. There's nothing to explain, he said, dropping his sledgehammer. The heavy iron head hit the marble floor with a sound that echoed like a gunshot. He walked past me, his shoulder brushing mine with a coldness that made me gasp. He walked straight past Otis and the men in suits, his head held high, his stride unbroken. He didn't look back once. A wise decision, Otis murmured, reaching for my arm. He was always going to be a distraction, Sloane. Your father knew that. He knew the Thornes were the only ones who could really hurt us, so that's why he made sure they were dealt with. I looked at Otis's hand on my arm. It felt like a shackle. What did you just say? I asked, my voice turning to ice. Your father knew the Thornes? Otis's eyes flickered with a momentary hesitation, a crack in his corporate mask. They were acquaintances, a long time ago. It's not important now. What's important is the board meeting. We have 30 minutes. I looked at the door where Kaelen had disappeared. I looked at the ruins of the library. And then I looked at Otis. In that moment, the Iron Heiress didn't break. She forged something new. You're right, Otis, I said, my voice steady, my eyes drying. It's time to go to the office, but I'm not going in your car, and I'm not going to give you an apology. I turned and walked toward my SUV, leaving them standing in the dust. My mind was racing. If my father knew the Thornes, if he had dealt with them, then the secret wasn't just in the money, it was in the history. I had to get to the Fourth Ward. I had to get to that shop before Monday morning. But first, I had to face the board. I had to see the faces of the men who thought they could own me. As I sped away from the estate, I saw Kaelen's truck in my rearview mirror, turning a corner and disappearing into the city. The rift between us felt like a canyon, a deep, dark abyss filled with secrets and lies. I wasn't just fighting for a company anymore. I was fighting for the truth, and I was fighting for the man who had seen the real me, even if he hated what he saw. The headquarters of Sterling Global felt like a tomb after hours. The floor-to-ceiling glass walls that usually showcased the power of the city now only reflected my own hollow expression. I didn't go to my office. I didn't go to the boardroom where the scent of expensive cigars and betrayal still lingered. I went down. The basement archives were kept at a precise 62 degrees to preserve the paper. It was a cold, sterile environment, miles away from the heat of Kaelen's shop or the dusty history of the mansion. I used my master key card, the one that the board hadn't deactivated yet. They thought I was at home, crying into a silk pillow. They didn't realize that when a Sterling is backed into a corner, we don't just survive, we dig. I searched for hours. My fingers grew numb as I flipped through filing cabinets from the late 60s. I was looking for Project Phoenix, the initiative that had launched my father's career and cemented the Sterling name in Atlanta's skyline. Then I found it, a leather-bound ledger hidden behind a stack of standard property deeds. I opened it, and the smell of old, sour ink hit me. It was my father's personal ledger. In his aggressive, slanted handwriting, he had documented every acquisition. My heart stopped when I saw a name scrawled in the margin of a 1968 entry, Silas Thorne. Next to the name was a note. Thorne refuses to sell. He thinks a partnership is a friendship. He's a fool. If he won't sign the transfer, the ink will find its own way onto the paper. Beneath that note was a practice sheet. My father had practiced Silas Thorne's signature over and over again until it was indistinguishable from the real thing. It was a forgery, a cold-blooded, calculated theft. My father hadn't outcompeted Kaelen's grandfather, he erased him. I sat on the cold floor, the ledger heavy in my lap. A sob escaped my throat, echoing in the silent room. My entire life, my education, my clothes, my very name was funded by a crime. I wasn't an heiress. I was the daughter of a thief. I didn't wait for morning. I drove back to the Fourth Ward, the ledger tucked under my arm like a weapon. The shop was dark, but I could see the orange glow of a single lamp through the window. I didn't knock. I pushed open the gate and walked in. Kaelen was sitting on a crate, a bottle of beer in his hand, staring at a piece of scrap metal as if it held the secrets to the universe. He didn't look up. "I told you to go home, Sloane." "I don't have a home, Kaelen," I said, my voice cracking. "I never did." He finally looked at me. His eyes were hard, but when he saw the ledger and the tears streaming down my face, the steel in his gaze flickered. "What is that?" I walked over and dropped the ledger on his workbench. "The truth. My father's private notes from 1968. He forged your grandfather's signature. He stole the land, the shop. He stole everything." Kaelen froze. He didn't reach for the book. He just stared at it as if it were a poisonous snake. "Why are you showing me this? You know this ruins you, right? If this goes public, Sterling Global is finished. You'll be lucky if you aren't in a courtroom for the next decade." "I don't care about the company," I whispered, stepping closer. The heat from the shop's furnace was still lingering in the air, wrapping around us. "I care about the look in your eyes when you told me I was just like him. Kaelen, I didn't know. I swear on everything I have left, I didn't know." He stood up, the sheer size of him suddenly overwhelming the small space between us. He took a step toward me, his breath hitching.
"You're giving me the rope to hang your father's legacy, Sloane. Why?" "Because the legacy is a lie," I shouted, the frustration finally boiling over. "I've spent 30 years trying to be the daughter he wanted, trying to build a world that was worthy of the Sterling name. But the name is rotten. And you, Kaelen, you're the only thing I found that's real." I reached out, my fingers trembling as I touched the sleeve of his jacket. "He destroyed your family to build a tower. I want to destroy the tower to give you back your family." Kaelen didn't pull away this time. He looked down at my hand on his arm, then back up at my face. The anger was gone, replaced with a raw, painful vulnerability that made my chest ache. "Are you really going to do it?" he asked, his voice low and raspy. "You're giving me the rope to hang your father's legacy, Sloane. Why?" "Because I've walked away from $1 billion for a welder from the Fourth Ward. I'm walking towards you, Kaelen, if you'll have me." He didn't answer with words. He reached out, his large hands cupping my face. His thumbs brushed the tears from my cheeks, his touch so tender it felt like a prayer. He leaned down, his forehead resting against mine. "You're a fool, Sloane Sterling," he murmured against my skin. "Probably," I whispered. He kissed me then. It wasn't like the almost kiss at the mansion. This was a collision. It was desperate and hungry, tasting of salt and wood smoke and years of unspoken longing. It was the feeling of two broken pieces finally clicking together. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me flush against him, and for the first time in my life, I felt grounded. I felt like I wasn't falling anymore. We pulled apart, both of us breathless. Kaelen kept his hands on my shoulders, his gaze searching mine. "Monday morning, the bulldozers, they're not going to stop just because we found a book." "I know," I said, a new kind of steel entering my voice. "But they're going to have to run over me first." Kaelen looked at the ledger, then back at me. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. "Well then, I guess we better get to work. We have a war to win." Monday morning didn't arrive with the sunrise. It arrived with the smell of diesel and the ground-shaking roar of engines. At 4:30 a.m., the Fourth Ward was usually draped in a peaceful pre-dawn blue, but today, the air was thick with the gray exhaust of yellow behemoths. 3 bulldozers and an excavator were lined up at the edge of the Thorne Ironworks property, like predators waiting for the signal to kill. Kaelen and I were standing at the gate. We hadn't slept. We had spent the night going through every page of that ledger, scanning documents and sending encrypted files to a legal contact I still trusted. "They're early," Kaelen said. He was holding a heavy iron pipe, his knuckles white. He looked at me, his eyes searching mine in the dim light of the street lamps. "Sloane, this is going to get ugly. The police, the private security, they aren't going to care about a ledger until a judge signs an injunction, and that won't happen for hours." "I'm not leaving, Kaelen," I said. My voice was surprisingly calm, even though my insides felt like a bird trapped in a cage. "Are you scared?" he asked softly. I looked at the lead bulldozer. The driver was already in the cab, his face obscured by a hard hat and the glare of the work lights. "I'm terrified, but for the first time in my life, I'm terrified for the right reasons." A black USV pulled up, its tires crunching over the glass and gravel of the street. The door opened and Henderson, the COO who had been my father's shark for 20 years, stepped out. He looked immaculate in a charcoal suit, a stark contrast to the grit of the neighborhood. He didn't even look at the shop. He looked straight at me. "Sloane," Henderson called out, his voice amplified by a megaphone. "This is your final warning. You are obstructing a legal demolition. You have no standing. You have no authority. If you do not move, we will proceed. Your presence here is a liability the company is no longer willing to ignore." "The land was stolen, Henderson," I shouted back. My voice cracked the morning air. "I have the ledger. I have the proof of my father's forgery." Henderson didn't blink. A dusty notebook doesn't stop a multi-million-dollar contract. Move, now. He gave a hand signal. The lead bulldozer roared, a cloud of black smoke belching into the sky. The ground began to vibrate. It started to crawl forward, the massive steel blade lowering until it was inches from the pavement. "Sloane, get back!" Kaelen grabbed my arm, trying to pull me toward the shop. "No!" I wrenched my arm free. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I ran. I ran past the property line, straight toward the moving bulldozer. I heard Kaelen shout my name, a sound of pure agony, but I didn't stop until I was standing directly in the path of the tracks. The machine was huge, a wall of yellow metal that blocked out the sky. The heat from the engine rolled over me in waves. The driver slammed on the brakes. The machine lurched to a halt, the blade stopping barely 3 feet from my chest. "Sloane, get out of there!" Henderson screamed, his composure finally breaking. "You're out of your mind." "Then run me over," I yelled back. I could feel the vibration of the engine in my very bones. "Because that's the only way you're getting into this shop. You want to talk about legacies? Let's see how the Sterling legacy looks when the headlines say you crushed the heiress to protect a lie." Kaelen was at my side in a second. He didn't pull me away this time. He stepped up beside me, his shoulder hitting mine, his presence a solid, unbreakable wall. "You heard her," Kaelen growled, his voice carrying over the rumble of the engines. "You want this land? You're going to have to take it from both of us." The neighbors began to emerge from their houses, people who had lived in the Fourth Ward for generations, grandmothers in robes, young men with sleepy eyes that quickly turned fierce. They saw us standing there. They saw the iron heiress and the master welder standing together against the machines. One by one, they started to walk toward us. They didn't say a word. They just formed a line, a human chain of defiance. "This is a circus," Henderson hissed. He turned to the head of security, a man with a tactical vest and a cold stare. "Clear them out. Use whatever force is necessary. We have a permit." The security guards moved forward, batons drawn. The air turned electric with the threat of violence. My heart was thundering. I looked at Kaelen, and he reached down, lacing his fingers with mine. His hand was warm, steady, and filled with a silent promise. "Whatever happens," he whispered, "I'm glad it was you." Just as the lead security officer reached for Kalen's shoulder, a high-pitched siren cut through the noise. It wasn't the police. It was a fleet of news vans, their satellite dishes rising like antennas. Behind them, a white sedan pulled up. A woman stepped out. Judge Myra Vance. No relation to my family, though the irony wasn't lost on me. She was holding a manila envelope. "Cease and desist," she shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. "I have an emergency injunction signed 10 minutes ago based on new evidence of property fraud." Henderson's face went white. He looked at the news cameras, then at the judge, then at me. But the victory felt hollow, because as the engines began to cut out, I saw something that no one else saw. Behind Henderson's USV, a second, smaller bulldozer, one that hadn't stopped, was moving toward the back of the shop. It wasn't part of the official crew. "Kaelen!" I pointed, but it was too late. A massive crash echoed from the rear of the building. The sound of splintering wood and groaning iron filled the air. The back wall of the shop, the part where the original 1968 beams were, the heart of the Thorne history, was collapsing. And as the dust cleared, I saw a figure stepping out from the shadows of the alleyway, holding a remote detonator. It was Otis. He didn't look like a driver anymore. He looked like a man finishing a job 50 years in the making. He looked at me, a cold, satisfied smile on his face, and then he disappeared into the smoke.
The sound wasn't a bang. It was a groan, a deep, agonizing sound of iron surrendering to gravity, like the earth itself was letting out a final, pained breath. The dust didn't just rise, it choked the very light out of the morning. It was thick and gray, tasting of old brick, ancient secrets, and the bitter copper of blood. I stood frozen for a second, my ears ringing with a high-pitched whine, my vision obscured by a swirling wall of debris. My world had gone from a standoff to a graveyard in 3 seconds. "Kaelen!" I screamed. The silence that followed was the most terrifying thing I had ever experienced. It wasn't the peaceful silence of a Sunday morning in the suburbs. It was a hollow, ringing quiet that felt like the world had held its breath and forgotten how to exhale. The bulldozers had stopped. The shouting had stopped. Even the wind seemed to have died. I scrambled toward the back of the shop, my legs feeling like lead. My designer work boots, the ones Kaelen said were too clean, slipped on the loose gravel and jagged shards of glass. I didn't care about the sharp edges. I didn't care about the heat still radiating from the engine of the rogue machine that was now buried under a mountain of brick. "Kaelen!" I screamed. "Answer me, please, Kaelen!" I saw a flash of denim under a pile of splintered wood. My heart stopped beating for a full 3 seconds. I threw myself at the debris, my fingers clawing at the rough, splintered mahogany. These were the beams we had salvaged from my father's mansion. The very history I had hoped would save us was now crushing the man I loved. My nails tore, and my palms, already raw from the work we had done together, began to bleed. I didn't feel the pain. I only felt the desperate primal need to find him. "Help me!" I yelled, turning to the neighbors who were still standing in frozen shock. "He's under here, please. He's in the back. Get over here." The community of the Fourth Ward moved as one. It was a beautiful, heartbreaking sight. A dozen sets of hands, rough hands, old hands, hands that had spent a lifetime fighting for this neighborhood, joined mine. We worked in a feverish, silent rhythm. We lifted a heavy iron joist together. We cleared away the bricks that had been laid by Kaelen's grandfather 50 years ago. And then I saw him. Kaelen was curled on his side in the dirt, his arm instinctively shielding his head. He was covered in a thick layer of gray soot, making him look like a fallen statue. His face was a sickly pale beneath the grime, and a jagged piece of rebar had sliced through his coveralls. A dark, blooming stain of red was spreading across his shoulder, soaking into the dust. "Kaelen," I whispered, dropping to my knees beside him. I reached out, my hand trembling so violently I could barely guide it. I touched his neck, searching for the spark of life. His pulse was there. It was thready and fast, like the wings of a trapped bird, but it was there. He coughed, a ragged, wet sound that made my own chest tighten with a sympathetic ache. His eyes fluttered open, searching through the gray haze until they found mine. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. Then the memory hit him, and the pain flooded back into his expression. Is it gone, Sloane?" he whispered, his voice barely a rasp. I looked past him, over his bleeding shoulder. The back wall of the shop, the sacred space where his grandfather had etched his name and the date into the foundation stone, was a mountain of rubble. The original forge, the heart of the Thorne family history, was buried under tons of broken brick and twisted metal. "The shop is standing, Kaelen," I lied, my voice breaking on his name. I stroked his soot-stained hair, my tears carving clean tracks through the dust on his face. "We caught them. The judge is here. The cameras saw everything. It's over." "The beams," he whispered, his hand reaching out feebly, clutching a handful of the gray dust. "They took it, even at the end, Sloane. Your father took it all." He wasn't talking about the bulldozer. He was talking about the ghost of Arthur Sterling. My father had reached out from the grave to finish the job he started in 1968. He had ensured that even if the land remained, the spirit of it would be crushed. The paramedics arrived, their sirens a distant, wailing scream that grew until it filled the air. I stayed on the ground with him, refusing to move as they worked around me. I held his hand as they loaded him onto the stretcher. He didn't let go. His grip was surprisingly strong, his calloused skin a grounding force in the middle of the chaos.
"Don't leave," he murmured as they lifted the gurney. "I'm right here," I promised, leaning down to kiss his forehead. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm staying right here in the ward." I watched the ambulance pull away, the red lights flashing against the gray ruins of the shop like a warning. I stood there for a long time, the weight of the loss pressing down on me like the rubble itself. The air still smelled of smoke and spent diesel. "He's gone, isn't he? The evidence, the legacy." I spun around. Otis was 10 feet away. He wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He was leaning against the black SUV, watching the smoke rise with a look of clinical, terrifying detachment. He looked like a man who had just finished a difficult but necessary chore. "You," I hissed. I walked toward him, the rage bubbling up inside me like molten steel. "Why, Otis? You were with us for 20 years. You saw me grow up. You saw what my father's legacy did to my mother. Why would you do this for him now?" Otis didn't flinch. He adjusted the cuff of his shirt, his expression as smooth and unbothered as glass. "I wasn't with you, Sloane. I was with the mission. Your father knew that one day you might have an attack of conscience. He knew you were soft like your mother. He left me instructions for this exact scenario." "Soft?" I laughed, a harsh, jagged sound that didn't feel like mine. "I just watched you try to murder a man to protect a piece of paper. That's not a mission, Otis. That's a pathology. I protected the foundation of your world. If that shop stood, the truth came out. If the truth came out, the Sterling name was mud. I've spent my life protecting that name. I wasn't going to let a welder and a girl in the middle of a tantrum undo decades of work." "He has the ledger, Otis. I gave it to him. It's in his hands." Otis smiled. It was a small, chilling thing. "Do you see the fire, Sloane? Look closely." I looked back at the rubble. Inside the ruins of the back wall, a small flicker of orange was beginning to grow, fed by the dry wood of the salvaged beams. The rogue bulldozer hadn't just hit the wall, it had ruptured a gas line for the old forge. "No!" I turned to run back, but the heat was already becoming a wall. "The ledger is in there," Otis said calmly. "The original deeds, the evidence of the forgery. It's all feeding the flames right now. By the time the fire department gets that out, there will be nothing left but ash. Your father's secrets will stay buried. And you'll go back to being the Iron Heiress, because frankly, you have nowhere else to go." I watched the flames lick the sky, turning the gray dust into a hellish orange. Everything we had worked for, the proof, the history, the justice, was burning. I looked at Otis, and for a second, I finally saw the man my father really was. He hadn't just built buildings, he had built a prison of loyalty and lies, and Otis was the warden. "You're wrong about one thing, Otis," I said, my voice dropping to a low, cold whisper. "And what's that?" he asked. "I'm not the Iron Heiress." I pulled the heavy metal ring Kaelen had given me from my pocket. I hadn't put it on yet. I looked at the dark oak inlay. "I'm the woman who's going to make sure you never see the light of day." I pulled out my phone. I didn't call my corporate lawyer. I didn't call the board. "Officer," I said, flagging down one of the policemen who was cordoning off the area, "I'd like to report a case of arson and attempted murder, and I have the eyewitness testimony of every person on this block." Otis' smile finally faltered. He looked around at the neighbors. They were moving in, their faces grim, their phones held high. Every one of them had a recording. Every one of them was a witness to the rogue bulldozer. "You think a jury will believe them over me?" he sneered, though his voice lacked its previous conviction. "In the new Fourth Ward?" I asked, stepping closer until I could see the sweat on his upper lip. "They'll believe the truth, because for the first time in 50 years, It's the only thing left standing.
He looked smaller in the hospital bed, stripped of his leather coveralls and his welding mask, but his eyes, those deep obsidian eyes, were brighter than I had ever seen them. "You're still here," he murmured as I walked back into the room with 2 cups of terrible cafeteria coffee. "I told you," I said, sitting on the edge of the bed and carefully avoiding his injured side. "I'm not going anywhere. Besides, I think the nurses are afraid of me. I've already filed 3 complaints about the temperature in here." Kaelen chuckled, though he winced immediately after. "The Iron Heiress is still in there somewhere, huh?" I looked down at my hands. They were bandaged too, the palms raw from digging through the rubble. "She's retiring, Kaelen. I'm just Sloane now. A woman with no job, a very angry board of directors, and a serious need for a shower." "And the shop?" Kalen's voice dropped, the lightness vanishing. "Tell me the truth, Sloane. Don't give me the PR version." I took a deep breath, the steam from the coffee hitting my face. "The back wall is gone. The forge is ruined. The ledger, Otis was right, it's ASHE. The fire department did what they could, but mahogany and old paper burned fast." Kaelen closed his eyes. A single tear tracked through the faint dust still caught in the corner of his eye. 50 years, 3 generations, gone in 20 minutes because a billionaire didn't want to be embarrassed. "It's not gone, Kaelen," I said, leaning in close. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small metal ring he had given me. I hadn't put it on yet, my fingers were too swollen, but I held it up so the sunlight from the window caught the grain of the oak. "This is the history, this and the way the neighbors stood in front of those machines. You said it yourself, wood and iron are just materials. The spirit is what matters, and the spirit of Thorne Ironworks is currently sitting in the hallway in the form of 20 people who refused to leave until the doctor gave them an update." Kaelen looked at me, his expression softening into something so tender it made my heart ache. "You really did it, didn't you? You called the police on your own family's shadow." "Otis is being held without bail. The arson charge is sticking. And because he used a Sterling Global vehicle to do it, the company is being hit with a massive civil suit. The board is scrambling. They're offering me a settlement just to go away." "How much?" "Enough to rebuild the shop 10 times over," I said, but I told them to shove it. Kalen's eyebrows shot up. "You did what?" "I don't want their hush money, Kaelen. I want the land. I want the deed to every lot they stole in the 4th Ward. I told them if they didn't sign over the titles to a community land trust, I'd take my story to every news outlet from here to London. I'd show them the photos of the rogue bulldozer. I'd tell them about the forged signatures." "But you don't have the ledger anymore," Kaelen pointed out. "It's your word against theirs." I smiled, a slow, genuine smile that felt like it was lighting up my entire soul. "That's what Otis thinks, and that's what the board thinks, but they forgot one thing about my father." "What's that?" "He was a narcissist," I whispered. "He didn't just keep a ledger, he kept a backup. He had a safe deposit box at a private bank in Midtown. I found the key in his desk months ago, but I never knew what it was for, until I saw the ledger. The key has the same serial number as the book." Kalen's hand found mine, his fingers interlacing with mine. "So it's not over?" "No," I said, leaning down to press my forehead against his. "We're going to build something new, Kaelen, not a skyscraper, a home for everyone." 3 days later, I helped Kaelen out of the hospital. We didn't go back to my penthouse. I had already sent my assistant to pack my things and donate most of them to a local shelter. I didn't want the silk dresses anymore. I wanted the denim. We drove to the ward. The air was still a little heavy with the scent of the fire, but the neighbors had already started clearing the debris. There was a folding table set up with sandwiches and lemonade. Mrs. Gable, 72 years old. She's lived next door to the Thorne shop since Kaelen was in diapers. She's the unofficial mayor of the block and has a memory like a steel trap. "Kaelen Thorne," she shouted, wiping her hands on her apron as we approached. "You look like you've been through a meat grinder, boy. Get over here and eat something." She turned her sharp, intelligent eyes on me. I expected judgment. I expected her to see the Iron Heiress and tell me to go back to my tower.
Instead, she reached out and pulled me into a hug that smelled of flower and peppermint. "You've got good aim with a hammer, girl," she whispered in my ear. "I saw you through my window. Your father would have hated every second of it. That's how I know you're doing it right." I felt a lump in my throat. I had spent my whole life trying to earn the respect of men in suits, but it was the hug of this woman that made me feel like I finally belonged. "Thank you, Mrs. Gable," I said, my voice thick. "Don't thank me," she said, pulling back and pointing at the ruins of the shop. "Thank that man of yours. He's been talking about the bridge girl for weeks. We all knew you were coming. We just didn't know you'd bring a sledgehammer with you." Kaelen laughed, leaning on his good arm. "I told you, Sloane, the ward knows everything." We walked toward the back of the shop, where the fire had been the hottest. The foundation stone was still there, the one that Kaelen's grandfather had carved. It was scorched, the edges blackened, but the name Silas Thorne was still visible in the stone. "Look," Kaelen said, pointing to the base of the stone. There, tucked into a small crevice that had been revealed when the mahogany paneling burned away, was a metal cylinder. It was rusted, fused by the heat, but it was intact. "What is it?" I asked. Kaelen reached down, his fingers brushing the soot away. "My grandfather always told me that if the world ever tried to take the shop would tell the truth. I thought he was just being poetic." He pulled the cylinder out. It was a time capsule, a physical piece of evidence left behind by Silas Thorne, buried in the very foundation of the building. "Open it," I whispered. Kaelen used a small pocket knife to pry the lid off. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a photograph. It was a picture of two men, young, smiling, their arms around each other's shoulders. One was Silas Thorne, the other was my father, Arthur Sterling. On the back, in Silas's handwriting, were the words, "The partnership that built a city. May our children remember the sweat, not just the steel." 1968. But beneath the photograph was the real treasure, the original signed partnership agreement, the one my father had claimed never existed, the one that proved the land was a 50-50 split forever. I looked at the photograph, then at Kaelen. The two men in the picture looked so hopeful. They hadn't known about the greed and the betrayal that would follow. But as I looked at Kaelen, I knew that the cycle was finally broken. "We didn't just find the truth, we found the way back," Kaelen said, his voice ringing with a new kind of power.
The boardroom of Sterling Global was exactly how I remembered it. Cold, smelled of expensive leather, and filled with men who thought they owned the sky. When I walked in, the air didn't just chill, it froze. I wasn't wearing my usual $5,000 Chanel power suit. I was wearing a simple black turtleneck, dark jeans, and the work boots that still had the red clay of the Fourth Ward embedded in the soles. I looked like a woman who had come to collect a debt. Because I had. "Henderson," said Monson, rising from the head of the table. He looked older than he had 3 days ago. There were bags under his eyes that no amount of concealer could hide. "You're trespassing. We've already served you with the termination papers. Security is only 30 seconds away." "Sit down, Henderson," I said, my voice cutting through the room like a blade. I didn't wait for an invitation. I walked to the seat that used to be mine and threw a manila envelope onto the polished mahogany table. "And tell your security to take a coffee break, unless you want them to be witnesses to the end of this company." The other board members, men who had known me since I was a child, looked at each other with flickering eyes. They were sharks, but they could smell blood in the water. And right now, the blood was coming from the head of the table. "What is this?" Lizard Man asked, reaching for the envelope. "That," I said, leaning back and crossing my arms, "is the reason my father was so afraid of the Thorne family. It's the original partnership agreement from 1968, not the forged version Otis tried to burn, the real one, the one Silas Thorne hid in the foundation of the shop." Henderson laughed, but it was a dry, hollow sound. "A photo of an old document? It's hearsay, Sloane. It's inadmissible. Any lawyer worth their salt will have that thrown out before lunch." "I agree," I said, flashing a smile that didn't reach my eyes, "if it was just a photo." But as it turns out, my father wasn't the only one who liked backups. Kaelen's grandfather didn't just leave a photo, he left a video. The room went silent. "In 1968, one of the older members scoffed, "video cameras were the size of refrigerators." "True," I conceded.
But Silas Thorne was a master welder. He worked for the city's top tech firm on the side. He had access to prototype surveillance equipment. He didn't just record the signing, he recorded my father admitting that he planned to use the Thorne name to secure the permits and then cut Silas out once the steel was in the ground. I pulled out my tablet and tapped the screen. A grainy black and white video began to play on the massive wall-mounted monitors. It was silent, but the body language was unmistakable. My father, young and arrogant, was pointing at a map. Silas Thorne was shaking his head. Then the camera caught a close-up of my father's face as he whispered something into Silas's ear. I hit the audio enhanced button. Kaelen had spent all night working on the file with a friend from the university. I don't care about the community, Silas. I care about the legacy. You give me the signature, and I'll make sure the Fourth Ward is a memory by 1980. You can stay in your little shop, but the land belongs to me. The voice was unmistakable. It was the voice of the great Arthur Sterling, the hero of Atlanta. The board members looked at the screen as if they were watching their own executions. Henderson's face turned a shade of gray that matched the dust of the demolition. That's not all, I said, closing the video. I've already sent a copy of this to the state attorney and to the descendants of the other 5 families whose land you've acquired over the last decade using the same tactics. The class action suit is being filed as we speak. Sloane, wait, Henderson stammered, his hands shaking as he reached for a glass of water. We can talk about this. There's a middle ground, a settlement, a seat on the board. We can rename the new plaza after the Thorns. We can make this right. You're still not listening, I said, standing up. I felt a surge of power that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with truth. I don't want a seat on your board. I want the board dissolved. I want Sterling Global to liquidate its assets in the Fourth Ward and hand them over to a community land trust. I want every family who is displaced to be compensated. And I want you, Henderson, to be the one to sign the confession. You're destroying your own inheritance, the lizard man shouted. You'll be left with nothing. I looked at the ring on my finger, the simple metal band with the oak inlay. I thought about the way the neighbors had stood in the rain. I thought about the way Kaelen looked at me when he thought no one was watching. I've spent my whole life with everything, and I've never been poorer. You can keep the towers. I'm taking the heart. I walked toward the door. I paused at the threshold, looking back at the men who had once seemed like giants. They looked small now, like children caught in a lie. Oh, and Henderson, I said. He looked up, a glimmer of desperate hope in his eyes. Otis talked. He gave the state attorney the names of everyone on this board who knew about the rogue bulldozer. I'd suggest you find a very good criminal lawyer. You're going to need one by tomorrow morning. I walked out of the building and didn't look back. The glass doors hissed shut behind me, and for the first time in 30 years, the air outside felt clean. Kaelen was waiting for me in his truck, parked at the curb. He had his arm in a sling, but he was grinning. "How did it go, Sterling?" he asked as I climbed into the passenger seat. "I'm unemployed," I said, leaning over to kiss him. He tasted of peppermint and victory. "Sounds like a good start to me," he said, shifting the truck into gear. "Where to, boss?" "Home," I said. "We have a shop to rebuild, and I think I'm finally ready to learn how to weld."
1 year later. The Fourth Ward didn't look like a construction site anymore. It looked like a garden. The new Thorne Ironworks stood on the exact footprint of the old one. But it wasn't just a shop. It was the anchor of the Silas Thorne Community Land Trust. The 3 blocks surrounding it, the blocks my father had once planned to pave over with cold concrete and glass, were now a vibrant tapestry of affordable housing, artist studios, and green space. The towers of Sterling Global still loomed on the horizon, but from down here, they looked small, distant, like monuments of a forgotten era. I stood in the doorway of the shop, the sun setting behind me, casting a long golden shadow across the floor. The air was sweet with the scent of jasmine from the community garden and the familiar, grounding smell of hot metal. Kaelen was at the forge. He wasn't wearing a sling anymore. His movements were fluid, powerful, and rhythmic. He was working on a gate for the new community center, a design of interlocking vines and sturdy oak leaves. I walked over to him, my own boots clicking on the floor.
I wasn't wearing a turtleneck today. I was wearing a linen dress, my hair natural and free, and the metal ring on my finger was polished to a high shine. Almost done? I asked, leaning against the workbench. Kaelen flipped up his mask. His face was smudged with soot, but his eyes were clear and full of a light that no boardroom could ever replicate. He leaned over the anvil and pulled me into a kiss, one that tasted like home. Just about, he said, his voice a low rumble. Mrs. Gable is already complaining that the garden fence isn't tall enough to keep the rabbits out. I told her I'd get to it by Monday. You're a hero, Thorne, I teased, running my hand over his bicep. No, he said, pulling me closer. We're just people who finally learned how to build something that stays built. He looked out the window at the kids playing in the street, at the neighbors sitting on their porches, at the life that had returned to the ward. You did it, Sloane. You really did it. You turned a demolition into a rebirth. We did it, I corrected him. I just provided the sledgehammer. You provided the foundation. We walked out onto the porch of the shop as the first stars began to twinkle over the city. A group of neighbors was gathered around a fire pit in the common area, the sound of laughter and a distant saxophone filling the air. Final transformation. I looked at my hands. They were scarred, yes. There were marks from the day of the fire and calluses from the hours I'd spent learning the craft from Kaelen. But when I looked at them, I didn't see ruin. I saw history. I saw a legacy that was written in sweat and love, not in forged signatures and blood money. My father's name was still on the towers, but my name, the name Sloane, was written in the hearts of the people on this block, and that was an inheritance worth more than any billion-dollar portfolio. I leaned my head on Kaelen's shoulder, watching the world we had created together. The bridge wasn't just a place where I'd almost lost my life anymore. It was the path that had led me to it. Kaelen? Yeah? I think I'm ready for the next project. He smiled, his arm wrapping around my waist. And what's that? The house on the hill, I said. The mansion. I want to turn it into a school for the arts, for the kids in the ward. I want the halls that used to be full of silence to be full of music. Kaelen laughed, a warm, rich sound. You never stop, do you, Sterling? Legacy is a full-time job, Thorne, and I've got a lot of catching up to do. As the moon rose over Atlanta, the lights of the Fourth Ward glowed like a constellation of hope. The Iron Heiress was gone, but in her place was a woman who knew that the strongest structures aren't made of steel, they're made of the truth and the courage to stand in the dust until the sun comes up. And that, my beautiful family, is how you turn a demolition into a destiny. Sloane and Kaelen didn't just save a shop, they saved a community and discovered a love that was stronger than any empire. I am so moved by their journey. But now, I have to ask you the final question. If you were Sloane and you walked through that neighborhood today, what would you feel? Pride? Peace? Or a little bit of fear that the past might still catch up? And most importantly, who in your life is your Kaelen? Who is the person who reminds you you're worth more than your mistakes? Tag them in the comments and tell them you appreciate them. Thank you so much for riding this emotional roller coaster with me. If you loved this story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We have so many more beautiful, intense, and romantic stories coming your way. I'm reading every single one of your comments, so keep them coming. I'll see you in the next one.